We'll hear, won't he? Donald Trump says we'll just have to wait and see if he'll concede the election should he lose on November 8th. Shifting demographics and Trump's sliding poll numbers could have serious consequences for some area down-ballot races. And Californians have some soul-searching to do as they slog through 17 state ballot measures. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Chris Genuine, editor and publisher of the Times of San Diego. Hi, Chris.
Great to be here.
Good to have you back. Reporter Joe Urardi of iNewsSource. Hi, Joe.
Hey, Mark.
Glad you're with us today. And Matt Hall, editorial and opinion editor for the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, Matt.
Always a pleasure.
Good to have you here today. Well, the third and final presidential debate may have crystallized the choice facing Americans in the bizarre 2016 election. The nasty woman versus the whiny man. That's how Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton characterized one another on stage in Las Vegas this week. But the big storyline was Trump's refusal to say he would accept the election result and concede should he lose. Here's Trump.
Do you make the same commitment that you will absolutely accept the result of this election?
I will look at it at the time. I'm not looking at anything now. I'll look at it at the time. What I've seen is so bad. First of all, the media is so dishonest and so corrupt, and the pile-on is so amazing. I will tell you at the time. I'll keep you in suspense.
Well, Chris.
And here's Hillary Clinton's response.
Let me respond to that because that's horrifying. You know, every time Donald thinks things are not going in his direction, he claims whatever it is rigged against him. He lost the Iowa caucus. He lost the Wisconsin primary. He said the Republican primary was rigged against him. There was even a time when he didn't get an Emmy for his TV program 3 years in a row, and he started tweeting that the Emmys were rigged against him.
Should have gotten it.
This is a mindset. This is how Donald thinks.
All right, Chris, let's start there. What does it mean when a candidate disdains the long tradition, peaceful transition, conceding defeat, and uniting with the new president?
Well, I think it's a dangerous precedent. And it's indicative of the divisive nature of this campaign. One thing that has distinguished America since its founding was the peaceful transition of power. When George Washington walked out of office and returned to Mount Vernon, that really set a precedent for the world. And we've been doing this now for almost 250 years. So it is scary in a way. Now, to be fair, Trump has done some backtracking. He said yesterday that he would, quote, abide by the rules and traditions of the many candidates who came before me. But he also said he wanted to see what the results were.
Yeah, he'll concede if he wins. Yeah,
but it's a dangerous precedent, and one I think we're going to have to repair after this election.
Yeah, well, what do you think's behind this? I mean, what's the strategy, Matt? Can you figure it out?
He's trying to keep people guessing and keep ratings up. I mean, look, you cannot overstate this. This is how societies lurch towards anarchy, right? I mean, in the 240-year history of America, the losing candidate in the presidential election and in almost every other election down the ballot has accepted the outcome. And so after the debate, we seized on this moment and led our editorial with it and said that this was a dangerous, as Chris said, a dangerous precedent. We got interestingly enough, some pushback the next day from folks who brought up Al Gore's situation in Florida and how he conceded and then he took back his concession. But my point is that these are apples and oranges situations. There you have Al Gore taking issue legitimately with specific votes in a specific state, and even when the high court made its ruling, very graciously conceding.
Many said it was his best speech of the campaign.
Which is probably why it was that close,
yeah.
right?
And
why he lost Tennessee, frankly. That wouldn't have been an issue.
And Richard Nixon in 1960, another very, very close election, and he conceded to John Kennedy, of course, at that time.
You know, this has really offended a very interesting group of Republican leaders, and that's the Republican secretaries of state across the country. The voter registration election systems are in the hands of Republicans in most parts of the country, and they're really incensed with this idea that it might be rigged because they're responsible for it. One person notably said, he was Secretary of State of Iowa, which is a Trump-leaning battleground state, said that he thinks it was, quote, in the way you phrase it in Iowa, a pretty darn good system here in Iowa. And he took it personally if anyone would attack that. You know, I think in reality, the American people, if they see a wide margin, they're going to conclude it's over. They're not going to wait for Trump to concede. And, you know, only if it's close, within a few thousand votes, is it going to be an issue. And the polls right now show Hillary Clinton way out in front. Real Clear Politics has her up 7 points.
Right, and that's an enormous margin here in these, certainly in recent elections, which have been very close, as we've noted. Now, what about, you mentioned Republican leaders and the folks who are at the state level controlling the voting mechanism, but what about the national leaders here? Have we heard from the leader of the Senate majority? Have we heard from the Speaker of the House?
We haven't heard from them, but we've heard a lot of speculation that if Trump were not to concede, that Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell,
both Republicans, of course.
Both Republicans, the highest-ranking Republicans, would concede for him. In other words, they might take the ball from Trump and do what every other American leader has done over nearly 250
What
years.
does that accomplish, though? I mean, that's like the Blue Jays saying, you know what, this World Series is under protest. They're not in it anymore. That's why this is such a dangerous precedent, right? Trump is kind of playing with fire here, and when he talks about voter fraud, those are so statistically small occasions that have happened in this country historically. But he's speaking to 30 to 40% of the country who believes him and hangs on his every word, and that's, I think, where you're running into potential issues on election day.
Dangerous, yeah.
Right. And there still are some leaders who are pushing this idea of a rigged election. One notable one is Jeff Sessions, who is the Republican senator from Alabama.
Very conservative senator.
Very conservative, on the Judiciary Committee, very anti-immigrant. He has continued to bang the drum for a rigged election. So it's scary. Now, will that hardcore of Trump support at the end, if there's a landslide, let's say for Hillary Clinton, will they just drop the issue? I hope so. If it's close, I think we're going to go through some tough times. Certainly more dangerous than with Gore and Bush in 2000.
Well, let's talk about some other storylines that emerged from this debate here. Some analysts say Clinton borrowed Trump's penchant for taunts at Barb. She called him Putin's puppet, that he choked on the wall issue when he met with the president of Mexico, and we heard her talking about whining about losing primaries. Was this effective? Did analysts say that she did pretty well with this tack?
I think she was enormously effective, and I think in some ways, she's not being given credit for how well that she did. A nationally televised debate is a venue where 30 years of public experience really come into play. She was prepared, she was disciplined, while Trump certainly was not. He was okay during the first 30 minutes, but he didn't have the discipline that she had. And I wonder if there's not a little tiny bit of sexism in how we approach this campaign. We talk a lot about Trump losing, but in fact, it may be that Hillary Clinton is winning. That her command of the issues, that her poise, that her sheer tenacity is making her the winner.
Now these, Matt, go ahead.
They both they both did a pretty good job of painting each other as caricatures, right? And so I think they both had very, very strong debates. And
genuinely don't like each other.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's like,
don't shake hands.
Donald Trump starts off his first question about the Supreme Court. He starts talking about how Ruth Bader Ginsburg disrespected him. So immediately he's not talking about his message, which is probably appealing to Second Amendment voters. And then he had a strong maybe half or two-thirds of the debate. But then to Chris's point, one thing that Clinton did very well, I thought, was goad Trump by calling him Donald, by raising issues that he clearly didn't disagree with. I mean, a big part of this debate is afterwards is analyzing where are the undecided voters going to go? Where are female voters going to go? And there's an exchange where Clinton brought up the women who have made allegations against Donald Trump. His response is, no one respects women more than me. Yet at the end of the debate, what does he say to the microphone? He leans in and he says, such a nasty woman.
It's interesting. These debates had huge audiences, and as you say, there's a long tradition and all. But in the past, candidates don't tend to answer the questions. They go back to their stump speeches, their talking points, with their comfortable knowledge here. Here, I think you had a real debate. You had people taking the gloves off and really going at it sincerely and honestly, and it got ugly at times.
I think some credit goes to Chris Wallace, who did a really good job as the moderator of picking issues that Americans cared about, making sure they stayed on the issues, and being fair and tough with both of them.
I will say, though, I think one thing that you hear about talking about Chris Wallace and performance, a lot of people said he did do a good job holding the candidates accountable, really pressing on the issues. But a lot of people noted that there were some issues that never got brought up in this debate: income inequality, poverty,
climate change did not get brought up in hardly any of these debates.
Any of the debates at all,
is
not
shocking.
1 minute, which a lot of people think climate change is the most important problem
Absolutely.
facing our country and our world,
Absolutely.
and it's just
And
not
big
been
marks
addressed.
down for him as a moderator and for everyone who questioned these candidates here. That is a critical issue, and it is shocking that it didn't happen. And I don't see in the last few days here it's going to become much of an issue as we go forward.
You know, I think what's happened in this campaign is there have been so many lightning rod issues that it's hard for any single one to rise up. You know, we haven't had a campaign like this that focused on immigration, on trade, on Russia spying on our electoral process. There have been so many issues. I can't remember a presidential race that had this many.
No, it's a good point, but immigration is, I mean, Trump has been way overhyping that compared certainly with climate change, I would put forward.
An interesting issue, particular, as it relates to the last debate, because Trump had an opening with the WikiLeaks revelations about Clinton's talks about open borders, behind closed doors to private banks. And when he had a chance to really seize on that and get points on her, he ends up off message, and they're talking about
letting
Putin.
it go.
So,
All right, we are going to shift gears now. If Donald Trump does sink further in the polls and Hillary Clinton wins decisively, there could be a profound impact on down-ballot races. The U.S. Senate is definitely in play and could be recaptured by the Democrats. The GOP-dominated House is still a long shot. But one race gaining national attention, surprisingly, is in California's 49th Congressional District. That's where once safe Republican Darrell Issa is in a tough fight with Democrat Doug Applegate. And Joe, you had an interesting story this week in setting the Trump issue aside, which we'll talk about, but the times are changing there for Issa in that district, right? And maybe that's a bellwether across the country with the demographic shift, huh?
It certainly could. I mean, you look at Darrell Issa and the message is kind of, you slipping, man. I mean, he is a guy who for 16 years, 15 years, 7 elections, cruised to re-election again and again and again, usually winning by 60 or more % of the vote.
Yeah, didn't have to break a sweat.
Didn't have to break a sweat. I heard that he never even had to put out lawn signs until this year, until the June primary, which is when, out of nowhere, a virtually unheard of Democratic challenger, a retired Marine colonel named Doug Applegate, took 47% of the vote. And all of a sudden, this race that was on nobody's radar, all of a sudden shot way to the top and attracted a lot of attention.
And ICE has been on everyone's radar because he did a number of these Benghazi hearings. He's done a number of investigations of the opposition, of Democrats, the Obama administration, and to the point where he's kind of been shunted aside by his Republican colleagues on that point. And now, interestingly enough, we see a flyer where he's praising his cooperation with President Obama, and he's got a picture of President Obama on his own flyer, Darrell Issa. I mean, is the whole world nuts?
Yes. Certainly this election cycle, I think, has shown the whole political world is sort of nuts right now. And Issa, you know, he's a guy who for years and years and years was a true blue, dedicated conservative Republican, and all of a sudden, kind of unbeknownst to him, his district was changing. It was becoming more moderate, more diverse, and it looks like he was kind of sleeping on it.
And so a lot of folks are looking nationally. There's some national money coming in there, oddly enough, where the neighboring district, and we'll get to Scott Peters, the Democrat who's holding that seat in the neighboring district. That was the big one 2 years ago. Everybody was watching that race, and the big money was coming in. And oh boy, if times changed. Well, you talk about Issa being a good party guy. He toes the line more than even the average Republican in Congress, right?
Yeah, that's right. We actually looked at the data, and as it turns out, Darrell Issa votes with his party, only votes against his party. I believe it's something like 5% of the time, 6% of the time. That's less than about 200 other members of Congress. So he's very much less than the average Republican. He's very reliable conservative vote. And again, that served him very well for very long, but it looks like it's no longer really helping him.
Now all of a sudden he's claiming he's working across the aisle and the great mediator.
One question, there have been a lot of competing polls, and you know, ISIS polls show him up by 5-7 points.
Comfortably, yeah.
Applegate show him you know, maybe down a point or maybe within the margin of error. What do you make of that? What do you think is really going to happen there?
So it's you know, journalists get in trouble when we become prognosticators, right? But what you have seen is a lot of internal polls have leaked from both sides, and I think what we see is that this is a very tight race, because even the best internal polls for Darrell Issa, like you said, usually only show them up maybe 5 or 6 points, which if you have to assume if they're leaking those are probably their best internal polls, which in general tend to favor the people who are paying for them anyway. So you'd have to imagine, you know, this is probably a toss-up at this point.
Let's talk about, we mentioned the neighboring district there. Democrat Scott Peters is the incumbent. Now he breaks with the party line. He doesn't toe the Democratic line. And what did your numbers show on that?
Yeah, so Scott Peters is a congressman who really has tried to cast an independent image of himself. He touts endorsements from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which almost always endorses Republicans. He made a big deal about voting for enhanced screening of Syrian refugees earlier in the year, broke with his party big time on that, joined Republicans on that. And that's sort of the case if you look at his kind of whole career. He votes more than twice the average Democrat against his party. He bucks his party only less than about 30 other members of the House.
All right, I did want to get back to the point we were making about we got a bite from Mr. Issa here and him divorcing himself now from Trump, but he has embraced him through this campaign. Here's what he said to KPBS Midday host Maureen Cavanaugh about his relationship with the GOP standard bearer.
After the videotape that we're all familiar with, will you still be voting for him?
I will not vote for Hillary Clinton. I want to see Mike Pence as vice president. I want to see Rudy Giuliani maybe as Secretary of State, Chris Christie as Attorney General. I want to see a reform team.
If you feel so strongly about not coming out and saying, I am going to vote for Donald Trump, I support Donald Trump for president.
No, I said I want to see Mike Pence. I will be voting for that ticket.
You will be voting for that ticket. Okay.
Is he hoping Mike Pence is going to emerge here as the head of the ticket? Trump's still there, I believe.
Maybe he's just hoping Trump will quit once he actually realizes what being president entails. Yeah. I'm not really sure. But, you know, this is the dance that a lot of Republicans in difficult races are facing. On the one hand, you know, they want to appeal to independents. They want to appeal to folks, to even Republicans who are not fans of Donald Trump. So they want to say, I disagree with what he said, I find it repulsive, or I disagree with many of his principles. But at the same time, they know a sizable portion of their Republican base that they need to win, like Trump, want Trump, and they're going to be very upset if they see them saying, I disavow Trump entirely.
All right, quite a tightrope. Well, let's shift gears to another issue in this campaign, down to the California ballot. Passions in the election extend beyond the personalities and qualifications of specific candidates. A pair of issues facing California voters on November 8th have drawn powerful arguments on both sides. And Matt, let's start with the death penalty here. There's 2 measures regarding the death penalty in California this year.
Yeah, there are 2. 62 would repeal it. 66 would streamline it. There is a lot of money being thrown at this campaign, a lot of discussion about it. Of course, California voters will remember that just 4 years ago, we went through this exercise, and I believe on a 52 to 48 split, decided to keep the death penalty, not to reject the death penalty. Okay. So here we are again, and it is an emotional issue. It's an economic issue to a lot of people. You know, and you got to wonder if having 2 ballot measures confuses things, or if people will kind of see through it. And come down on one side of the issue.
Chris?
I've often heard that strategically, if you have 2 ballot issues on a confusing
on the same
issue,
topic,
the same topic, that tends to produce a no vote on both, because the voters say, I don't understand how these are different. I'll just vote against both of them. We certainly have that with the plastic bag issue.
Yeah, I think the bag issue is a little different because that is more muddied. I mean, this is clearly, if you are paying attention, you know that one eliminates the death penalty and the other keeps it. Yeah. And so that's the issue.
And I guess nationally, I think there was a Pew poll out maybe last week that said support for the death penalty was at its lowest level. I think it was 48 or 49%.
Right. If you go back to 1994, that poll had 80% support nationally and down to 49% now, as you say. So is it time for California? But the latest polls are not favoring getting rid of the death penalty.
I mean, it's a difficult ask. People see the death penalty as a necessary kind of provision in the criminal justice system, right? So it is the worst punishment for the most heinous crimes. for people who view it emotionally, it's tough to see past that. I think two issues to keep in mind are, one, the economics of it. I think it's $5 billion the state has spent to kill 13 people since the last execution. You know, and you're talking just some other numbers, 1,000 people condemned, only 13 again executed. Right. So the question becomes, is there a political will to implement the death penalty in this state? And right now it seems like none of the politicians want to do it. So we basically have a de facto death penalty repeal now anyway.
And there's the issue in California and places, death rows across the country. Some folks have been found to be innocent, usually through DNA analysis. Those cases have been overturned. So there is a question of fairness as we go along as well. It'll be interesting to see. Has your paper come out yet with a position on abolishing the death penalty?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Okay.
In fact, on Sunday, we'll have that very editorial.
And I imagine you expect some strong response from readers.
Yeah, no question.
On that one. Well, let's move on now. I did want to talk about Prop 64, and that is the measure to legalize marijuana. Looks like it will pass. The polls are pretty clear on that one. It's popular here, and the poll nationally on that one showed 60% of Americans support legalization. That's up from 12% way back in 1969 here. We expect this to pass. We're going to be dealing with legal pot here?
Maybe. I think you see a lot of cities, San Diego for one, waiting for that eventuality by putting measures on the November ballot that says if the marijuana legalization measure passes, here's our sales tax.
Here's a structure to tax it, regulate it.
So we can make some money too. You know, so there's a lot of folks in California looking to Colorado, looking to Washington to see what works, and there's a lot of money being spent. We talked about money in the campaign. I think it's $18 million for the yes side and $2 on the no side. So there's clearly a disparity, which may explain some of the polling numbers.
Yeah. Chris?
One of the great ironies of the marijuana proposition is that California already has a marijuana industry, and the growers in Northern California,
the medical marijuana,
marijuana growers, they're against it because they're scared of being forced out by agribusiness when this becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah, the LA Times this week profiled a couple of longtime growers up north, and is anybody going to weep for these folks who've been growing it and profiting from it, legally or illegally over all these years?
That's one of the criticisms of the measure, is that it creates essentially big tobacco 2.0, right? And there are some people who complain about that and who think that that's a possibility, and others who look at the trend and say, you know, maybe this is something whose time has come.
And not just, I think, and not just looking at obviously the economic arguments, but I think a lot of people have noted that there's a criminal justice and a real issue of fairness here in terms of who actually is locked up for marijuana. It's disproportionately people who are African American, Latino, poor, and they say, you know, the whole marijuana kind of criminal justice regime here is very discriminatory, and that it should also be kind of done away with in that sense.
There are a lot of reasons to look at it. One of the, I think another reason beyond that one is the economics. My recollection is that it would cost San Diego to regulate this measure $650,000, and they could get 22 to 35 million in return by taxing it 5 or 8%. So that's a big driver here too.
Chris?
There's one issue that could play against it, and that's drug driving, which is becoming more and more significant. Most of the law enforcement agencies say that's the biggest issue for marijuana. Will we have more accidents on the roadways? And you can argue it both ways, but I think that's something that may resonate against passage.
And how do police regulate if they think you're driving high? I mean, obviously breathalyzers are pretty good at accurately talking about. There's no test right now, so that's a real quandary. Another quandary, as I was noting, the LA Times had an editorial this week about pot likely to remain a cash business here because it's still illegal under federal law. Banks and credit agencies are reluctant to give loans for investors, reluctant to set up a whole credit system as we do with any other commerce here. And so how do you track it for tax purposes and for income tax and for the sales taxes you're talking about?
No question, that's one of the biggest points of tension between the federal law and the state laws. Because if it's a cash business, what does that mean? It probably means increased crime because you're going to knock over a shop to get the money out of there.
Security's a big issue, yeah.
And so that's a problem. But the pro side will tell you that as California goes, so goes the country, right? So if California legalizes it, other states may follow, and eventually the federal government, you would assume, is going to have to do something.
Right, it's on the ballot in several other states as well. At least medical marijuana is. The door's open, I think North Carolina, Arkansas, Florida, of course we've talked about California. So at some point I think Congress is going to have to take this up on some national level, right?
Probably, and California could certainly force the force the issue. And it might also, on the drug driving thing, there may then be some federal law on how that's interpreted as well.
Yeah, so we'll have to get to that. I wonder, of course, it'll depend on what the Congress is, who the administration is, and who's going to champion this, because for a lot of politicians, this is one of those, that's kind of a stinker in the corner. Do we need to get behind
it's interesting, comparing these two measures, the death penalty and marijuana, just looking at, obviously I pay attention to what other editorial boards in the state are doing with their endorsements. Almost every editorial board has editorialized in favor of repealing the death penalty. The marijuana legalization is much more divided.
Much more divided.
You know what I mean?
All right, well, we'll see how that plays out. We have run out of time. That does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Chris Genuine of the Times of San Diego, Joe Girardi of iNewsSource, and Matthew Hall of the San Diego Union Tribune. All the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. And another reminder, we have a voter guide at KPBS, got lots of information about your ballot with explanations of the propositions and links to stories and coverage that we've done. And that ballot, of course, is thick as a phone book, so that'll be very helpful to go to the KPBS voter guide. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.